Ladies and gentlemen, this is Harinet Zete. My name is Annette Sheckler, and on behalf of my colleagues, Mimi Sabatu and Desta Haile Selassie, I want to welcome all of you to our show. I want to give a special shout out to our producer, Saarom Hadush. Our goal at Harinet Zete is to facilitate a robust discussion on topics that concern Tigray, Ethiopia, and the wider Horn of Africa region. And we invite you to subscribe to our program on YouTube at Hara Connections, one word. We broadcast our programs in Amharic, Tigrinya, and English. And again, on behalf of my colleagues Mimi and Desta, I would also like to thank the Tigray Media House studio located in Northern Virginia for all of the help in putting our shows together. Thank you. And one more thing, we would like to wish our Orthodox friends a joyous and peaceful Easter tomorrow. In the 1940s, in Western Europe, the Nazis and their allies committed a genocide against 6 million of the Jewish people. While this was happening, Germans led the Jewish people into gas chambers, smoke choking people in the surrounding towns and villages. The U.S. stood back, not wanting to be pulled into a European war. Later, in our shame, the international community echoed the words of the Jewish people and said, "Never again." In 1994, only 50 years later, Rwanda's Hutu government committed a genocide against almost 1 million Tutsis and some Hutu moderates, hacking them to death with the same machetes they used to tend their crops. Canadian General Romer, a member of the 800-person UN peacekeeping force, traveled to the UN in New York with documents outlining the plan to exterminate the Tutsi people. The international community stood back and did nothing, while the news broadcast the mass killings that took 1 million lives over just 3 months. After the Hutu military in Interahamwe were routed, crossing the border and taking with them 3 million people who had participated in the killing of their neighbors and sometimes family members, the international community responded by setting up refugee camps in the DRC and other neighboring countries to shelter these so-called refugees. Tutsis were left to die in Rwanda. Once the bodies were buried, the international community repeated the words of the Jewish community and said, "Never again." And in November 2020, after planning for 2 years, the Ethiopian government, along with their friends, the Eritreans and the Somalis, sent troops into Tigray to kill, to rape, to commit a host of atrocities against the people of Tigray in an effort to, according to the Prime Minister, wipe out the Tigrayans for 100 years. This was said to the Foreign Minister of Finland. And unlike other genocides, the genocide against the people of Tigray was live streamed. The world watched the genocide in real time. Today's guest, Mr. Martin Plaut, is well known to Ethiopians and Tigrayans everywhere. A South African by birth, Martin Plaut has written extensively about South Africa as well as the Horn of Africa. He was an internationally renowned journalist with the BBC for many years and is now a fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London. You can read more about Martin and what he's thinking at martinplaut.com, or you could follow him on Twitter. Today, we have invited Martin to talk about his book, Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. Here is how the publishers have summarized the book. Hatred of Tigrayans has been stoked by senior advisors to Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. They have called Tigrayans weeds who must be uprooted, their place in history extinguished. This language is reminiscent of the statements that preceded the genocide in Rwanda. The present situation has been orchestrated since 2018 by Eritrea's President Isaias Afwerki, who wields considerable influence over Ethiopian affairs. His troops still are deep inside Ethiopia, his security agents in towns and cities. For both the Eritrean president and the Ethiopian prime minister, this appears to be a fight to the finish. Welcome, Martin. It's such a pleasure to have you on our inaugural show in English.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's an incredible book. I urge everyone to buy it. It's now so many people are buying it. It's out of print, but my understanding is we'll be able to purchase it in the U.S. in May. Let's begin with hate speech. ESAT radio, according to your book, became a staple of middle-class Ethiopian viewers. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role ESAT played in promoting hate speech.
Well, what was so striking about the whole of the war, which was, sadly, probably the bloodiest conflict in recent times, far overshadowing the conflict in Ukraine, I'm afraid. I mean, Ukraine, perhaps 100,000, maybe 200,000 people dead, and the war in Tigray, costing anywhere between 800,000 and 1 million lives. I mean, that's the scale of what was going on. And, part of that obviously was conflict, straightforward war, in which, soldiers confront soldiers. And I'm afraid, tragically, as we know, down the ages, people die. But the other half of it was the attempts to kill civilians. And that is the really unacceptable side of this war. Not just to kill them, but also to eradicate them through rape, sexual abuse. And, there were many statements that we saw, things being said like, when women were raped, not just once, not just twice, but repeatedly, gang raped for days on end, with people saying to them, this womb will never bear Tigrayans again. It's now Hara territory, sort of. I mean, not exactly those words, but that was what they were implying. I mean, and then to see, these kind of statements repeated on radio and television with people close to advisors of the Prime Minister Abiy, making statements like these and not being taken off air, but remaining Prime Minister Abiy's advisors. And that is deeply, deeply shocking. And, something that, frankly, I think people should be held to account for.
How was it, Martin, that Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian government so quickly and so thoroughly took control over this narrative about the origins of the war and this law enforcement operation? And were you surprised that the international community bought this in such a wholesale way?
Well, I'm not sure that they did. But, you have to disaggregate the international community, because it depends to what you mean by that phrase. But I'm not sure that they did. But let's take your question in two parts. I mean, the reason that Abiy and through him Isaias were able to take control of the narrative was very simple. Eritrea never allows independent correspondents to be based in its territory, and very seldom allows independent journalists to visit Eritrea. So they have a blanket, restriction on all forms of independent reporting from their territory. And of course, that since 2002, they have also, made sure that independent Eritrean journalists can report from Eritrea either. I mean, they were thrown into jail. All you have now is state media. Full stop, end of. And Ethiopia, of course, has a better situation. There are independent journalists, there are independent, media, including newspapers, and they are vigorous and vibrant, although their journalists repeatedly get picked up and have an extremely tough time. And I'm afraid that's been going on for many years, not just under Abiy Ahmed either, and which is regrettable. But when the war came about, in a sense, Prime Minister Abiy learned from the Eritreans. I mean, he learned many things from the Eritrean government, but one of the things he learned was don't let any information out. So in addition to the blockade, which was to prevent supplies getting in, there was an information blockade as well. As of course you and all your viewers know, you couldn't get through on radio, on television, on phone calls. The internet was down, electricity supplies were cut, everything was cut. I mean, it was a miracle that the Tigrayan authorities managed to get any messages out, which they did actually quite successfully, to be honest. But there was no possibility of independent journalists getting into Tigray. Now, in various ways, I actually managed to help. I think it was 2 journalists who approached me, and through my contacts with some members of the Tigrayan diaspora, I helped them to get into Tigray, and they did some work, and they risked their lives to do it. And I said to them, look, you must know this is going to be incredibly risky, and if I pass on this contact to you, that's the last I want to hear from you, because I do not want to be the one who spills the beans and gets you into trouble. So, by doing that, they sealed off the war. And if you don't have contemporary photographs or images, it's very difficult for, television to carry the story. And it's very difficult for newspapers to carry the story, because they are, all they can say is, well, this side says that, this side says the other, we don't know what's going on. What they need is journalists on the ground. That's why the Ukraine story has been so much better told, is because, New York Times, Al Jazeera, whoever you name it, has journalists at least on the Ukrainian side, and some even on the Russian side. Now, that does mean they can get the story out. You couldn't get the story out in the Tigray war, and that meant it fell down the news agenda, because there's no way of reporting things endlessly without having first-hand accounts.
In fact, I'd like to go back a couple of years. You mentioned the role of Eritrea, and I hope to talk about that quite a bit during this interview. This rapprochement that took place early on in the Prime Minister's tenure, what did you think when this happened? Did you think that this was an authentic bridging of this war that ended in 2000? We saw these wonderful photographs of people, cheering in the streets and in Adigrat, big markets, of Eritreans buying things from the Tigrayans and hugging and kissing, and even Isaias and Abiy dancing together. Having written extensively about Eritrea and following Isaias Afwerki all of these years, what was your sense during the news of this rapprochement?
Well, partly I suppose I hoped that it would be a genuine, ending of the tension between the two governments. And it might have been, it could have been. But perhaps I should have been a bit more skeptical about what was going on. Because, the one thing you learn over the years from President Isaias is that he doesn't change his spots. He has been somebody who is determined to control events, internally, externally, in any possible way that he can. And Eritrea itself is a democratic desert. There's no constitution, no parliament meets. There's no independent media, anything like that. So, I mean, he controls everything in his own country, and he thinks this is the way things should be organized everywhere in the area. And of course, that's rather different from Ethiopia, which has at least a limited form of democracy and representation. So they're very different. But on the other hand, the one thing you can be sure is that President Isaias, whatever his weaknesses, the one thing he's not weak about is planning and plotting. And he has been doing this all his life. I mean, going back to the 1970s when he joined the Eritrean liberation movement, or even earlier than that, he basically, the two things you need to know about him. One is that he went to in his early years with the ELF as it then was. He was sent to China, and it was the height of the Maoist era, and I think he learned a lot from Mao. And Mao was extraordinarily ruthless in the way that he operated, and I think that Isaias learned from that. And you then get the early years of the 1970s when the Tigray People's Liberation Front is formed, and they have good relations with the Eritreans, but only up to a point, because there are basically huge divides between them. I mean, the TPLF basically believes in the rights of all ethnicities to have independence up to separation up to including independence if they ask for it. And they didn't regard the Eritreans as democratic, because the Eritreans said, we are one nation, and our 9 nationalities, our 9 linguistic groups, all are Eritrean, and the Tigrayans were critical of that. There was also differences of opinion about strategy and tactics. The Eritreans wanted to hold areas of land around Nakfa, which I visited during the war, and the Tigrayans said, no, this is a mistake. But they worked together, and then they fell out, and they fell out so badly that in 84-85, I'm sure no Tigrayan has forgotten, the border being sealed with Sudan, and 100,000, 200,000 Tigrayans having to march out into Sudan to survive. And thousands died along the way because the Eritreans had closed the border. And as a result, there have always been good relations and bad relations. But, after that period, they came together in Khartoum. They agreed that they could work together because they needed to basically take both capitals, both Asmara and Addis Ababa, at the same time, or they would be bombed flat by the Ethiopian military if they didn't do that. And so they did. They worked together. And let's not forget that it was Eritrean troops that helped the TPLF take Addis Ababa in 1991. And they were close together at that moment. And it was Meles Zenawi who went to the Eritrean independence in 93 and said to them, recognized Eritrea's independence, but importantly made one statement. He said, let's not look at the scars on our back. And it sounded like a strange thing to say, because, what scars? What are you talking about? What he was saying is, let's forget the past. Let's, get on with things together. But they didn't, and there were further problems leading to the 98 to 2000 war, 100,000 people dead, maybe more. Then they agreed at the Algiers to have the boundary legislated by an independent boundary commission. Both sides said they would accept whatever came out, and I'm afraid Meles didn't. He refused to accept the border. And Isaias then rightly said to the international community, why aren't you enforcing this? You asked us to go along with this message. Why aren't you? And the international communities sort of shuffled their feet and said, well, we need Ethiopia. And so Isaias got more and more bitter about the international community, and rightly so. I mean, in this sense, they were right. So, there was this long period of good and bad relations, and tension and was never ended. And Isaias decided from, I think, that period onwards that he would do everything in his power to get rid of the Tigrayans, whatever it was required. So he, for example, supported the Al-Shabaab in Somalia. He plotted with various groups in Ethiopia, even to attack an African Union summit, place bombs in Addis Ababa. And he was absolutely delighted when the TPLF, through the EPRDF, was ousted from power. And when Abiy came to power, he realized this was an opportunity for him to have his revenge on the Tigrayan people and the TPLF. And there is the beginning of the plotting that he engaged in. And gradually he won over Abiy, he won over the Somalis, which was why when the war erupts in November 2020, it is as a result of an invasion by the Somalis, by working with the Eritreans and the Ethiopian troops and all the ethnic militia. He had lined everybody up, and he thought they would sweep the Tigrayans away. Now, through extraordinary courage, the Tigrayans reorganized, got back Mekele, attacked used guerrilla tactics very, very successfully. And you know the story from there onwards. They almost fought their way eventually to, what was there, 100, 150 kilometers from Addis. I mean, they threatened Addis at one time. The UN and the French and the Americans, everywhere, were pulling their people out. So it was close to victory, but finally it was not. And I'm afraid the Tigrayans paid a terrible price. Sorry, this is a rather long answer to a simple question. But, I think at the heart of all of this, it comes down to President Isaias being absolutely ruthlessly determined to get rid of his enemies, the enemies as he sees it, of the Eritrean people. But I think the one thing that gives me great hope, and I've never given up hope, was what you mentioned right at the beginning, what were the markets along the border, with people hugging each other, embracing, cheering when the Eritreans came across, even embracing President Isaias in Addis, because at the end of the day, the people of Eritrea and Ethiopia and the Horn will always live next to each other. There is no alternative, and they are the same people. I mean, essentially. I mean, they have, many of them share the same languages, the same religions, and so on and so on. They have much, much more in common than they don't. It's only the leaders that have difficulties in relating to each other.
Well, there's a couple of points I want to get back to later on in our discussion. One is being so close to Addis Ababa, TDF, but I'm struck by your comment about Isaias's penchant for planning and being very good at it. I remember before Abiy Ahmed took power, when EPRDF was in power, there was this tension between the government of Ethiopia and the U.S. Department of State about Ginbot Sabat. Birhanu Nega, Andargacho Sige. Ginbot Sabat openly raised funds in the U.S. to purchase arms. They were shielded and aided by Isaias and Asmara. Birhanu and Andargacho were there. And the U.S. kept saying, why do you care so much about Ginbot Sabat? I mean, it really was disconcerting to them, and thought that it was an obsession that should be dismissed. Can you talk a little bit about the role Ginbot Sabat played in this whole planning of the war against Tigray between Abiy Ahmed and Isaias?
I mean, forgive me if I don't know all the details of this, because it is a long and complicated story.
Everything in Ethiopia is long and complicated, and as you mentioned, never simple.
You're absolutely right, which is why it makes it so fascinating.
Yes.
But the let's not forget, if you go back, say, to 2005 and the elections in Addis Ababa, they did pretty well, and the Tigrayans lost power in Addis, but there was terrible conflict. Hundreds, well, I believe, were killed, and they were driven underground, and they went into exile, and they saw the need to look to regional neighbors, and Isaias was one of those neighbors that they went and reached out to. And I remember, for example, when Harinet Zete was, you may remember, kidnapped from Yemen and brought by force to Addis, and pretty badly tortured, as far as I know. Now, he has been an exceptionally bitter and angry man ever since, and has done everything in his power to attack the Tigrayan people, and who he saw as being responsible for what happened to him. And he worked with President Isaias, and Isaias has always used and continues to use dissident elements within the other countries very, very effectively, and he's incredibly good at doing it. I mean, is he not already training some of the Fano? And that's what you hear. So, I mean, all he's done is to use a playbook, which is to say, I rule my country absolutely, and anybody who stands in my way, well, I will find a dissident in his country, or, well, it's always his. I think in the Horn, I can't remember hers running anywhere. So I will find these cracks in their facade and work at them. And that was why, I mean, he did exactly the same with Al-Shabaab, putting arms, funds, assistance into them, not because Isaias is an Islamist. I mean, he's never been an Islamist in his life, but because he saw them as a way of attacking Ethiopia. And that's the beginning and end of Isaias's planning. But I mean, what is he doing right now? Who is the person who has been to Asmara most recently from the region? It's Hemeti from Sudan, and look at what's happening in Sudan right now. The RSF, which Hemeti leads, is in a full-scale battle today with the Sudanese army. I've no idea how this will end, and who will prevail, and what the result will be. But you will be pretty sure that Isaias was given heads up on this. Now, has he had a role in this? I've no idea, but he's close to Hemeti, and there's another group of people that he's prepared to work with, as he is prepared to work with the Chinese and with the UAE and with the Russians to get his own way.
We'll come back to that in a minute, but it's understandable to me, based on Isaias's personal antipathy towards Tigray, as well as his political aspirations. You say in your book that Eritrea has always been too small for Isaias. But I want to ask you about the Somali engagement. I'm just going to read a couple sentences from your book. In January 2022, detailed reports of the Somali role in Tigray were published by the journalist Lucy Casa. She put the number of Somalis in Tigray as high as 10,000 and outlined appalling acts they had committed. Survivors told the Globe that the Somali troops had massacred hundreds of civilians in villages controlled by the Eritrean military, often beheading them. No Ethiopian troops were present in the villages, they said. What was Farmajo getting out of this engagement in Tigray? Or what did he hope to get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know. I mean, one of the things one shouldn't forget is that the Eritreans have had a long relationship with the Somalis. During their 30-year war of independence, often they relied upon the Somali people to give them assistance, particularly passports to go around the world. They traveled on Somali passports quite often. So President Isaias has had close links with the Somalis for years, and he maintains links always with people that he thinks he can use.
But this was quite extraordinary, sending 10,000 troops.
Absolutely, it is. I mean, I can't explain what Farmajo wanted to get out of it. Perhaps he saw it as a way of gaining expertise for his troops, because the Eritreans are pretty good at training troops. Perhaps it was a way of him getting money. I mean, I've no idea. I mean, Isaias has access to funds basically through the mining sector. And let's not forget that Eritrea is one of those countries in which there is no budget. There is no budget whatsoever. They never publish a budget. President Isaias uses funds as he wishes. Most of it is of the funds that he receives from the mining houses that work in Eritrea are held offshore. And this was, accounted for by the Sanctions Committee of the United Nations. They published indications of where this money was held, particularly in the Gulf, but they also get held all around the world. And they can then be deployed in any way that he wishes to. So it's quite possible that he provided Farmajo with financial incentives to do this. I don't know, but that's a possibility. I think it was part of a vision which the Somalis with Eritrea and Ethiopia thrashed out after they made peace. So after 2018, they then said, well, we're going to have an organization which will bring the three countries together, and we'll reform the whole of the Horn of Africa in the way that we want to. And that was the plan, was to find a new way. They would replace organizations like IGAD, which has been around for years and years and years. IGAD did a great job in controlling locusts, but at political level, it's been less successful. Isaias has always hated IGAD. So he thought, well, let's have a new structure for the Horn of Africa. We will control it, brackets, I will control it. And the three nations will come together to reshape it. And hey, Somalia, give us some troops, we'll train them. And then in the usual way, when, from once he had the troops, he could use them, frankly, in any which way that he wanted. And they were definitely involved in the war. And I think Lucy Casa has done some fantastic work in reporting what other people had no idea that was going on.
And pardon me for jumping around a bit, but I am very interested. As you mentioned in your book, the EU played a relatively unimportant role in making peace or stopping the war, and so on. It was the U.S. who was pretty much on the front lines of talking about the war, sending various special envoys, which we'll get to later. But there was one quote in your book: the United States strongly condemned Tigray's, quote, unjustifiable attacks against Eritrea and its efforts to internalize the conflict. Could you talk a little bit about this hesitancy within the U.S. government, knowing we think full well what was happening there, and its criticism of Tigray's, in the beginning they sent missiles there?
Well, wasn't that during President Trump's time in office?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Perhaps that explains it.
Well, President Trump was, shall we say, an interesting president.
We could say that, yes, indeed.
Who took all sorts of positions about all sorts of things. I mean, look at his relationship with North Korea. Look at his relationship with Russia and Putin. I mean, were they friends, enemies, or allies? I have no idea. I mean, they seem to play all three at the same time. Very odd. He didn't. I mean, President Trump's knowledge of and interest in Africa probably doesn't isn't the size of a pea. I
You're
mean, he
generous.
really has no interest in it whatsoever. And I mean, I think some of the remarks that he made about Africa, which are unrepeatable on air, is just not what you want to talk about. So it doesn't surprise me that probably the State Department just put it in front of him. And let's not forget, in the early days of the war, the Tigrayans did have some missiles. They did hit, Asmara a couple of times. They did hit Gondar, and then they either ran out of missiles or decided that it wasn't a useful strategy, having been pressurized by the United States. But I presume that was what the United States was referring to at that particular time.
But let's get to the Biden administration. Let me see. Yes. I'm quoting your book again. The New York Times reported, and you say, presumably by way of a deliberate leak, that the government, meaning the U.S. government, had determined that Ethiopian troops and allied militia were conducting a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing. Biden's new ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, decried what she referred to as conflict-induced starvation, this whole, starvation as a weapon of war. I want to relate it to the U.S. government's penchant for both-sidisms. How do you see that?
Well, it's the standard position of all governments, is to try and be even-handed about things, except where their own direct interests are involved. That's absolutely normal. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest. You could see the same kind of things said. For example, about by the South Africans about Ukraine. Well, on the one hand, on the other, it's what foreign governments do about foreign affairs, unless there is a direct stake that the country has. So that doesn't surprise me. And why should a country like the United States, which has interests around the world, and let's not forget that for any American administration, Africa is relatively low down on its list of priorities. The major one is Russia, as it was the Soviet Union, and China, and everything else is. I suppose Mexico probably comes next after that. I don't know, but those are their major concerns, and so it doesn't surprise me that they take a kind of even-handed approach on these issues, unless pressed. But in private, of course, they say different things.
Yes,
and that's always the way.
Yes, which brings to mind the role of the diaspora in the U.S. I'm not as familiar with the role of diaspora in Great Britain, where you are, but in the U.S., the Ethiopian diaspora in particular has really mastered their power as voters and lobbyists, and had played an important role during EPRDF's tenure in keeping this tension, at least between the Congress and the EPRDF government, alive and well. What are your thoughts about the role of diaspora worldwide, both in terms of the Ethiopian perspective and the Tigrayan perspective?
Well, I think both have been very successful in their own ways in pushing their agendas. The Ethiopian diaspora pushed hard to try and both before and during the war to get their perspective going. And so did the Tigrayans. I went on marches with the Tigrayans here in London, which were very successful and very large. I'm rather sad, actually, that they seem to have petered out now, because I think there's plenty more that could be done. And that's the joy of living in a democracy, as you know, is that you have the right to ask your representative, whoever he or she is, to take up your cause and take it up in the way that you see fit. Now, some of the congressmen and women took up one side, and some took up other sides, depending on who their lobbying
voters were. Yes,
and who looked, the way they looked. But I mean, I think that's entirely legitimate. You can like it or dislike it, but that's not the point. That is the role of all ethnic groups in a democracy. I mean, look, for example, at how the Jewish community has lobbied for years and years about Israeli situation, and frankly, the Palestinians just haven't managed to mobilize people in the same way, which is a pity, because they have an exceptionally good case and every right to try and get it across.
I would like to do this. I'm going to, because as an external person, I'm very concerned about how the international community writ large has responded, not just to what happened to Tigray, but what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Bosnia, what's happening with the Rohingya, etc. These are international questions. I'm going to give you an institution and ask you just to describe its role in the Tigray conflict in one word. Let me start with the AU. Not to put you on the spot, which I've done.
Sad.
The EU?
Divided.
The US?
Effective.
Kenya?
Good.
And last, the UN?
Ineffective.
And last, South Africa.
Struggling. I mean, let's not forget with the South Africans that they did actually, Cyril Ramaphosa managed to get the Ethiopian president within, 10 days of the war breaking out down to South Africa. They agreed a strategy for getting 3 former heads of state of Africa to resolve the issue, to go on a mediation mission. And it was endorsed by the Ethiopian president. And then Prime Minister Abiy just said, no, absolutely not, definitely not. They can come and have a look, but I'm definitely not allowing them to mediate, and they're definitely not going to Tigray. So that was the end of that. So I mean, South Africa did try, but what can you do if your opposite number doesn't play ball? You don't have much you can do.
I thought your word for the AU was so apt, so on target. Sad. Were you able to follow the comings and goings of the U.S. Special Envoys?
Well, up to a point. I have colleagues in the United States who watch this very closely and try and brief me and my colleagues with what goes on. So actually the United States is fairly easy to keep a track of. The only person we never really got a good grip on, who is possibly one of the most important people, is Yamamoto, who has the longest track record in the region, is one of the most respected people, and never says anything. And I think that it was his work that led to the peace agreement between Abiy and Isaias back in 2018. And it's not the first time he has been involved in this way. He's very, very effective, but very quiet.
Well, I would ask never says anything or never asked.
No, I've asked, I've tried.
I mean by the United States government, by his former colleagues at the Department of State.
Maybe. I don't know, but I have huge respect for him.
Yes.
But that it's just the way he works, and there's some people who work that way, and it works. But then, of course, he has a big stick behind his back, which is the power of the United States, which everyone is never quite sure what on earth they're going to do. And I mean, the United States' influence is not just simply in terms of sanctions or military force, which can be deployed at times. I mean, look, we've got military force in Somalia, which is gradually beginning to be a bit more effective than it has been. But I mean, through things like the World Bank and the IMF, I mean, the Ethiopians have been kept on a very tight string by the IMF, and they really are struggling hard to get renewal of their agreements. But then, of course, one mustn't forget the role of China and Russia. And I don't know if you plan to come to that, but I mean, their role, particularly in the United Nations, has been predictably negative.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I'm especially interested. We are all familiar with Russia and their footprint in Africa, and we're equally familiar with China's footprint in Africa. But this engagement of the United Arab Emirates, this engagement by Turkey supplying the drones to the Ethiopian government, what's your take on this? How far do you think this will go?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question, and I'm not really sure whether I'm in a position to answer it. I mean, the UAE is a strange country. It's a number of countries that work together as an alliance. But they've been very aggressive in the strategy towards the Horn of Africa for many years, and have pushed their interests very strongly, both economically and militarily. And so it doesn't surprise me that they were going to get involved. I mean, for example, they're close to Hemeti, and what is their role in the current situation in Sudan? We don't know, but you can be sure they have something of a role. Turkey, I mean, I think was delighted to be able to export its drones, which have been proved to be very effective. And they didn't just provide drones; they also provided technicians who went and trained the Ethiopians on how to use them and what they could do. And if it hadn't been for the drones, and I mean, I'm not a military analyst, but it seems to me that the Tigrayans might have actually reached Addis because it was the drones that really made it almost impossible. I mean, it took out a lot of their heavy weaponry, some of their trucks, and worse than that, it allowed the Ethiopians to view what was going on the ground in some of the most remote locations. And that is, very, very helpful because, airplanes can look down on the ground. They can't hover and stay there for hours and give a detailed indication of what is going on. And I think it changed the nature of the war and reversed the Tigrayan ability to attack across the most rough terrain. I mean, just extraordinary terrain at speed, on foot, which without paths. I mean, just amazing, absolutely amazing what they were capable of doing, and then retreating, at speed as well. I mean, honestly, it is one of the great achievements of modern warfare was how the Tigrayans managed to rout, 3 armies plus militia over such a huge area with very, very little outside support. Now, how little support they had from outside, I was not aware of them getting almost any support. Right? Although there were suggestions of some limited flights from Sudan. Now, that has never been stood up, but there were some indications of that. But they couldn't have carried more than, shall we say, telecoms, for the Tigrayan government to use to maintain their very slight links with the outside world. But I think that may have helped with maybe some things along those lines, but very, very little. And but that, in a sense, also underlines the strategy that the Ethiopians and the Eritreans had right from the beginning, which was to cut the links between Tigray and Sudan. And yes. Western Tigray has been under their control ever since, and continues to be so. And I think that both Asmara and Addis Ababa are determined that the Tigrayans will not have a link to the outside world through Sudan. And when there were attempts to cut the road between Addis and Djibouti, which there were on several occasions, they came close but never quite managed it. So Tigray was left like a little island in a sea of animosity, and that was a very, very difficult situation to be in. And whether one is critical or not of the Tigrayan government, one would hate to have had to make the decisions that they had to make about what to do and what to give up and how to do it. I mean, really, really tragic, terrible sacrifices that they called upon their people to make, and the people made it. And then to have to go into reverse and give up ground that you had lost your friends and brothers and sisters over taking. I mean, wow, that is a retreat is also said to be the most difficult of all military operations.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that, but first I want to ask you about not going into Addis Ababa. I'm not a military strategist, I know nothing. And yes, I think we all agree that it was the factor of the drones that took away this really extraordinary offensive on behalf of the Tigrayans. My understanding is that the U.S. told the government of Tigray that they were not to go into Addis Ababa, that they would virtually be cut off from everything. Do you agree with that? And what do you think happened?
Well, that's what I heard too. And nobody's ever contradicted it, so I presume it's true. Because if things are untrue, people usually come up after a while and say, hang on, this is rubbish, we never said that. So I presume it's true. But there was one other issue, which was that if they had taken Addis, it wouldn't have been like in 91.
Right.
They'd have had to fight their way through the suburbs. And there were plenty of people who were so furious with the Tigrayans and loathed the Tigrayans so much that they would have given their lives to do it. Now, the other really difficult thing to understand is what was the relationship between the Tigrayans and the Oromo? I mean, they signed an agreement, they fought briefly together, but that didn't seem to go anywhere. And then the Tigrayans signed another agreement with a wider group of Ethiopians, and that seems to have disappeared without anyone ever mentioning it again. So, I mean, to what extent has Tigray kept its allies informed? To what extent have they brought them along when they changed strategy, discussed it with them before they did it? I've no idea. But I mean, if I was, shall we say, from one of the southern groups who supported the Tigrayans in the Washington agreement when it took place, I'd be asking some questions.
Were you shocked by this is a leading question, were you shocked by the terms of the cessation of hostilities agreement?
No. I mean, if one wants to cut to the chase about it, it was a surrender. It wasn't an absolute surrender. Tigray still held Mekele, but by the skin of their teeth and at huge sacrifice. And clearly they just could not continue. As far as I can tell, and, again, this will require picking over carefully over many years. I think they didn't have much in the way of ammunition anymore. I think they still had the support of their population in to continue the fighting as long as it was necessary. But, if you don't have sufficient ammunition and you use huge quantities of ammunition when you are involved in the kind of really heavy fighting that there was going on in the north, I just don't think that they could continue. So in a sense, they made a deal. It wasn't a great deal, but it was a deal. And Tigray exists. There is a government which is led by Tigray. It's not had a the kind of foreign imposition which happened during the last time that Mekele fell, and they now are negotiating as equals with the government in Addis Ababa. That's not a bad outcome. The real weakness has been, in a sense, where we began this whole discussion, which is with the Eritreans, because the Eritreans were not involved in the negotiations, and in a sense, quite rightly, because that would have, it was an internal issue for Ethiopians of all ethnic groups to resolve. But on the other hand, it was really not a civil war. It was a regional war, which is what I was trying to sort of talk about at the beginning. Isaias was always involved. The Somalis were always involved. Now, if you didn't have him involved in the negotiations, well, then where was he going to go? I mean, he hadn't signed up to anything.
Right.
Now, he may have been told, be nice, take your troops out. I mean, the United States has been asking Isaias to pull his troops out of Tigray for months, if not years. And he's taken no notice of it whatsoever, and has continued to maintain his people both in Tigray, but also in other parts of Ethiopia, including having sort of security forces security personnel, not forces, in Addis Ababa, and monitoring people at the airport. So that's if you didn't have them in on on the tent inside. Well, they did the opposite, and that's Isaias for you.
Well, Martin Plaut, I have 1,000,001 other questions. We hope you'll come back and talk to us more. Maybe catch us up on what's happening in Sudan. And on behalf of Harinet Zete, thank you.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's honestly been an honor.